Good evening, everyone. This is Clare Lopez with you again this evening. I am with Clare Lopez, Lopez Liberty LLC. And as we know, everything has been wall-to-wall coronavirus for, it seems like forever already, doesn't it? But tonight, what I thought I would do is a little bit of a tour d'horizon. We'll start with coronavirus and the implications here in the United States, some statistics, over to Europe, a little bit worldwide. But then I want to move on to cover a few more things that I think are still important because, you know, the rest of the world actually is still spinning on its axis. And so I want to talk a little bit about the Saudi-Russian oil price war. And then through the Middle East, a little bit more about Israel and what it has been confronting with regard to Islamic Jihad groups like Hamas, and then wind up with a few last notes about Iran. We covered, for those who were on last week, we covered quite a bit about the worldwide pandemic now of the coronavirus, but with specific reference to how totalitarian regimes in China and in Iran were dealing with it, by contrast to how our free and open society is dealing with it, you know, not perfectly, but openly, transparently. And I think that was the big contrast that we drew last week. So for anyone who may have missed that, United West, of course, will have that podcast for anyone who wants to go back and look at it. Sharia Crime Stoppers, a program of the United West. So let's launch into this here. The big news of this past week, of course, is that the World Health Organization did declare the coronavirus outbreak a pandemic, not just an epidemic. It had to meet a few more standards in terms of spread and lethality to be called now a pandemic. The official name for this, of course, is COVID-19, coronavirus disease -19, 19 for 2019, because as we know now, this thing had already broken out in China no later than November of 2019 last year, perhaps even a bit earlier, but certainly by December, the Chinese full well knew what they had on their hands, and they were concealing it. Totalitarian Chinese communist regime, concealing it, trying to minimize it to the rest of the world until it was no longer possible to hide what was going on. Insofar as United States goes, we now have upwards of 3,800 cases. Out of all of those so far identified, there have been, I think, upwards of 70 now. It might be 71 or 72 deaths from COVID-19. The vast, vast majority of those succumbing here in the United States are elderly with underlying and serious health issues. Many of those, the first cases indeed, were in Washington state nursing homes. Today, now, every state except West Virginia has cases, but look at the numbers again, 69, 70, 71 deaths. I believe it's over 70 now today. Today, the 16th of March, 2020, a bit over 70 cases identified. I'm sorry, deaths identified out of a total around 3,800 cases identified overall. That is a 0.018% mortality rate. Now, obviously, numbers are going to rise. Let's look at the world. Overall, in the entire world, there are something like 171,000 identified COVID-19 cases. They have occurred in at least 158 countries. We know, of course, there are 194 countries in the entire world, so that's the majority of countries around the world have cases, and they've occurred on every continent in the world except for Antarctica. Overall in the world, there have been now around upwards of 6,500 deaths, and that works out to a mortality rate of about 3.8%. Much, much higher than here in the United States, because included in that mortality rate of 3.8% is the understanding that places like Iran and like China have healthcare systems whose standards are way, way lower and different than what we have in the United States, and a great deal of that mortality outcome depends on care. It depends on identification of the actual disease itself and then the care for it. Now, most cases in the entire world, as well as here in the United States, are mild cases. In any case, people may feel quite crummy for a couple of weeks. And then the overwhelming majority of people, upwards of 90%, I think I've even heard Dr. Fauci say 99% of all cases here in the United States at least recover. Even the majority of people who catch this in China are recovering or have recovered. For some reason, and thankful for it, kids seem not to be vulnerable to the COVID-19 disease, although they certainly can be carriers. I saw a very interesting graphic map this afternoon as I was researching things, and it showed that the outbreak of cases of COVID-19 all over the world, the majority of those cases lie along a very specific band of latitude that has, in those countries, they have very similar temperatures and humidity levels. We're talking about a band that is primarily what you would call the temperate zone, and that is how the United States lies along the same latitude as parts of Europe, going eastward across parts of Iran, and then far eastward China itself. I thought that was very interesting. And the website also made note that as the warmer temperatures of spring and summer here in the Northern Hemisphere approach, we may see, and we expect to see actually, quite a lot of drop off in the rate of infection with COVID-19. I want to call your attention to another website that I find very useful on a day-to-day basis, and that's the Glenn Beck website, carried on the Blaze network. I think it is subscription, but it carries very useful day-to-day, every single day, updates on numbers, caseloads, US, worldwide, as well as videos that Glenn and his cohorts do on the website every day. Now, I want to mention again Dr. Anthony Fauci. I am really impressed with this guy, I will tell you. I don't know if you know, first of all, he is the director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases at the NIH, National Institutes of Health. Dr. Fauci, the short gentleman with the silver hair and the glasses who speaks every day at the national Trump team press conferences, he's 79 years old, okay? When I get to be 79, that's how I want to be. In any case, today he mentioned that the peak of case outbreaks here in the United States is yet to come, and he does not rule out the need, as we go forward in the next couple of months, to more stringent levels of lockdown that may be localized to what President Trump referred to as hotspots, meaning not the whole country is going to go under some kind of martial law lockdown. No, they definitely deny that that is what's being considered at this time. But what they said is that specific areas like New Rochelle, for example, in New York State, might be an area or areas like that where there are localized hotspot outbreaks. They might have to have more stringent quarantine requirements. Meanwhile, this past week, the Chinese Communist regime is trying to spin things. Well, what else is new, right? And to pin the blame for the COVID-19 outbreak on the United States. This is something I just found out this past week too. I can hardly even believe it, but last October 2019, the Chinese held an invitational military sports game tournament. Where, you might ask? Well, where else? Wuhan, China. Wuhan, Hubei, China, Hubei province, China. And so the Chinese, you think they knew by October of last year that there was an outbreak coming? Just questioning there. But the Chinese regime certainly by November, a couple of weeks after the games, knew about the outbreak. Nevertheless, I just can't even wrap my head around the fact that the United States government agreed to send military sports team competitors to this tournament in Wuhan, China. Boggles my mind. In any case, that's what happened. And the Chinese communist regime in Beijing is now using that sports tournament as the excuse for trying to pin blame for the outbreak of the coronavirus on the United States, that we somehow brought this virus with our team. Well, hogwash, of course, but this is what they're saying. Last local mention would be Mexico. So far, there have not been a whole lot of cases south of our border in Latin America, Mexico or south. But cases are beginning to pop up in Mexico, which is a weak and a corrupt state. And they have taken very few steps to prepare for what's coming. They don't have travel bans on international travelers coming in from any place, including China. They don't have health surveys going on or temperature screenings being done for international visitors arriving in Mexico from the European Union, now the world center of the outbreak, or China. And they do only have a few dozen cases of COVID-19 in Mexico so far, but let's thank you, Donald Trump, for building as much of the border wall as has been completed so far. And if we can speed that up, it will be to the good. That is not to ignore our northern border with Canada, that too, given Canada's propensity to welcome migrants from anywhere and everywhere. That border too bears watching. All right. I have been impressed this past week with the daily briefings that are coming from the president's and the vice president's, Mike Pence's medical team. This past week, on Wednesday, the president spoke from the Oval Office and suspended at that time travelers, but not cargo, travelers from the EU, Britain, the United Kingdom, Ireland have been added to that list more recently. Now, that is because, as I said a bit ago, Europe's become the epicenter for this outbreak. And if we can take any consolation at all, it is that it seems, okay, now seems because we don't have international good numbers, but the Chinese are telling us that their outbreak is somewhat gradually beginning to subside. But Europe's the epicenter now. Press conference just a couple of days ago, we had the announcement from the Federal Reserve that it has cut its interest rates to near zero, between 0 and 0.25. And also the US government is going to inject liquidity into the markets. That means printing more money, essentially, is what that means. Obviously, this will increase inflation and national debt. question, is the solution worse than the illness to begin with? Well, we shall see, but in the immediate press of the outbreak, these are the steps that the Trump administration is taking. Now, what I also was impressed with was the public-private partnership that the president has put together, again, and Mike Pence, who is the leader, the designated lead for the U.S. government on the COVID-19 virus outbreak. That public-private partnership was evident in press conferences earlier this week when the president, vice president, and members of the team from NIH, CDC, Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta, added to their press conference a number of the CEOs, presidents of various companies, including pharmaceutical companies and including retail drugstore outlets like CVS, Walgreens. Also, there was Walmart, there was Target, and putting them together, I thought sent a strong message that while these companies are cutthroat competitors ordinarily in the marketplace where they typically compete for customers, in this instance, they're pulling together to support in any way they can. For example, giving over their parking lots to drive-through testing locations, and then of course also making available more quickly, as fast as they can, pharmaceutical, medical supplies within their stores. Now, back to Europe briefly, I want to talk about a few of the countries there and what they seem to be doing about this. Many of the EU countries have completely closed their borders as we speak. The Schengen Accord, which, as you know, was an agreement among the EU countries to essentially deal with each other on an open borders basis. Well, the Schengen Accords are no longer functioning at this point in time as these countries close their borders to cross-border traffic. Emergency measures are in effect all over Europe to ban large gatherings, as here, to require testing and quarantine for those found to be affected or places found to be centers of outbreak. Schools and workplaces are closed at least for the next couple of weeks. Across Europe, the numbers I have now are 42,000 or so who have tested positive for COVID-19, 1,600 dead in Europe. Now that is a solid 4% mortality rate, higher than anything we've got here, higher than what they've got in China. And it's also spreading very fast in Europe. They did not close down their borders quickly enough. They did not implement travel bans quickly enough, especially Italy. It looks like Italy was the country that allowed this coronavirus into the continent. And you say, why Italy? Well, because Italy actually had I guess still has, a lot of Chinese workers brought into the country, brought into Italy because of their low, cheap labor rates. And it was failure to close down the back and forth air travel between Italy and China that allowed this virus into Europe by way of Italy. They did not have a travel ban. They may now. I'll bet you they wish that they had not kicked Salvio Mattini out of office. He was the interior minister for a time and a deputy prime minister. Also, Italy skews towards an older population, perhaps than even other countries in Europe. And so their medical system has been totally overwhelmed, especially in the north. That is the place where they had the majority of these Chinese workers. That is the place where the outbreak's been the worst in Italy. and their medical system is completely overwhelmed. The hospitals, the clinics, they've got to turn people away. They've actually had to engage in triage, which is a heartbreaking scenario going on over there, where because they're full up, absolutely full up in every hospital and every clinic, they're spilling out of the corridors and into, you know, the lines outside. There are not enough doctors, there are not enough nurses. Some of them are getting sick now too. They're actually doing triage on who might benefit the most from treatment, and those, typically the older, in the 80s, 90s age groups, that might not benefit from treatment in any case, and they're being left. In Italy overall, they've got around upwards of 21,000 cases. They're in Italy a 5.8% mortality rate. That is the highest, I think, that I know of anywhere in the world. And it's because, not because the disease is somehow more virulent or lethal in Italy. No, it's not. It's because their healthcare system has not been able to keep up with the flow, and therefore people are not getting the treatment they need in terms of oxygen, ventilators, ICU treatment beds, and so forth. Let me look quickly at Spain here. Of note, the wife of the Spanish Prime Minister, Pedro Sanchez, has tested positive for COVID-19. Overall, in Spain right now, they have around 6,300 identified infected cases with COVID-19, and about 200 have died. In Spain, as in elsewhere in Europe, everything's shut down. The schools, places of work, everything trying to stem the spread of this virus. And the way that they can do that is to stop people from moving about or mixing with other people, especially in large groups. Let's look at France very quickly, where President Macron has just announced a 15-day lockdown on the entire country to slow the spread of the coronavirus in France. And that means no school, everybody stays home from work, all the tourist spots are closed, transportation is nearly completely shut down. That's France. The United Kingdom, and this probably feeds into one of the reasons why President Trump was forced to add the UK plus Ireland into the travel ban that we already had in place from Europe. And you're not going to believe this. I can't wrap my head around this, but the UK is actually encouraging the spread of the virus, wanting it to reach 60% infection rate of the population, because somehow the UK government believes that this will encourage and promote and accelerate what's sometimes called herd immunity. That is, if enough members of a society have been exposed to the virus, some caught it, some sick of it, some not maybe showing symptoms but exposed anyway, the virus has no place else left to go. And then that is called, and then resistance builds up within that population, and that is called herd immunity. Okay, that's Britain. Just a couple last notes on COVID-19 before I move on to some other topics. You're probably hoping I move along quickly here. It's very important to note that as the United States and other places too ramp up the ability to produce and the availability of test kits, of tests, and that more and more people get tested, there will be more and more confirmed cases of COVID-19. But think about this now, more and more confirmed cases, overwhelming majority of which will recover. That statistic, while higher numbers of infected, will drive down the overall mortality rate, right? Because even if you get a lot more people that test positive, most of them are going to get better, and only a few of them will die. That makes the lethality rate, the mortality rate, go down. So keep that in mind, even as we see numbers going up in coming weeks. Right now, here in the United States, the overall mortality rate for COVID-19 is perhaps 1%. And you'll hear people saying, oh, that's 10 times the rate of the common flu. Okay, yes, but the common flu rate is something like 0.1. 0.1, that is 1/10 of 1% mortality rate for the common flu. And we have something like 30,000 deaths from the common flu every year. That represents a 0.1% mortality rate for flu, okay? If that gets to be 10 times higher, you reach 1%. If that happens with COVID-19, you're still looking at 1%. I mean, every human life is precious and everyone lost is a tragedy, but 1% would still be a low level of mortality. All right, let's go to the stock market, which has been an absolute roller coaster ride this week, and the overall economic picture. So there is more than one cause for the jitters in the stock market, and it has to do with both COVID-19 and the oil price war going on right now that I will get to in just a moment. Now, President Trump's speech from the Oval Office, and then again another speech this past week, the daily press conferences, have not calmed down the jitters or stabilized the markets. And even the rate cut by the Fed this week to near zero did not calm the jitters. We lost another, I don't know, 3,000 points or something on the stock market today. Best advice, stop looking. Just don't even look at it. And for heaven's sakes, anybody with a 401k or an IRA, just don't look right now. Don't look. Here's another point, though, and it gets to an article that I published this week. I am able to publish articles on the Drudge website, and I called it Deep Breath Everyone. You can find that Deep Breath Everyone published yesterday, March 15, 2020, at Drudge. And one of the points I'm making there is that both the media, left-wing media, Democratic figures, they need to stop trying to crash the US economy just in order to better their own abysmal chances in the November 2020 presidential election. COVID-19 is not a campaign tool for partisan politics, so cut it out. The US economy is in the strongest position it's been in years, thanks to Donald Trump and his administration's efforts. And it is also among the world's industrialized economies the best, most solid in terms of the basics of all of these industrialized countries' economies. Now, what is causing the jitters, what is causing the disruption, and will continue to do so for weeks at a time here, is that state and municipal authorities are implementing measures to shut down businesses and schools and other gatherings. And then as a cascade effect, many people are simply canceling their events, speaker events, other kinds of gatherings. And that is what's going to cause the severe economic hardship that is coming for many. Now, President Trump has announced a number of measures to help industries hard hit, like the airline industry, like the cruise ship industry, hospitality industry. Remains to be seen, exactly how much help will be available to the smaller privately owned businesses that depend on a steady stream of customers and traffic into and out of their shops, for example, how much help will be available to them. But that's where the real impact will be felt. And as we heard today at the press conference, the president spoke of a washing through, he put it this way, a washing through of the effects of the coronavirus, he said, by perhaps July or August, which may seem an infinity away from us here as we speak here in March of 2020. But let's hope that it may be no later than that and perhaps sooner. The other thing that I want to mention here while we're talking about the U.S. economy is that U.S. dependence on Chinese production of goods for this country must end. And in particular in critical areas that we're looking at here, like medical supplies and pharmaceuticals, the production of our prescription medicines, for example, and the precursors that go into making them. Supply chain disruption ought to be a wake-up call for U.S. industry, but also I'm hopeful an opportunity too, that U.S. businesses, industry, and with administration encouragement and incentives, financial incentives, it'll be an opportunity for many of them to either jump into production or get back into production of things that they had let go overseas before. Yes, it may mean that prices will need to rise for those things because U.S. labor costs are higher than labor costs in China. That's why the business went offshore in the first place. But we may have to accept that in lieu of accepting an enemy, hostile regime like the Communist Party of Beijing, China, holding production and delivery, sale of our pharmaceuticals over our head, as they did explicitly this week, explicitly threatened, I should say last week, this past week, explicitly threatened to cut that off. We cannot allow ourselves to be in that position. If it means paying some higher costs, well, so be it. But again, a market opportunity for U.S. businesses, we may hope that they will take advantage of that. We've got to tread finally here, last note on industry. We've got to tread a fine line between shutting down the virus and shutting down the U.S. economy and pushing all of us into a recession, which the president today, in his remarks at the press conference, did not dismiss as a possibility. All right, let's talk about the Saudi-Russia oil price war, because, with all this attention on coronavirus, I'm not sure if we've all noticed the drop in gasoline prices, for example, at the pump. Well, I noticed when I last filled up a few days ago, and in my area of the Washington, D.C. metro area, the prices were down in the range of $2.20 a gallon for regular unleaded, and that's significantly less than I'd been paying over the last several months. Now, what happened here? How this happened? What's going on? So, in months past and leading up to early March of this year, OPEC oil producers and also some non-OPEC oil producers had been engaged in negotiations about production cuts because they wanted to stabilize prices that had begun to dip per barrel because of less demand worldwide for oil. And so they wanted to prop up the prices, and they wanted to do that by cutting production. So less product available, prices hold steady, that's what they were after. Well, everything was going along, sort of, until early March. By the way, prices per barrel are in the upper 20s, low 30s dollars per barrel. Well, early March, as these negotiations are going along, Russia suddenly, I gather, rather abruptly refused to go along any further. They just broke out of the talks and said, we're not doing this. We're not cooperating on this anymore. And they did not want to lower production. Now, they have rarely, I don't know if ever, willingly lowered their production. And part of that has to do with the difficulty of opening and of maintaining their oil wells, which lots of them are located out in Siberia, the far eastern reaches of Russia, where the ground in winter is packed, hard, solid, frozen. It's tundra, it's permafrost, and then in the spring and summer, briefly, that permafrost sort of melts into mud. It makes it extremely difficult to drill in such conditions, and it also makes it very difficult to maintain the wells and keep them open and producing year-round with the temperature swings that they have and the different soil conditions that result. So for all of those reasons, Russia just doesn't cut production. To the contrary, Saudi Arabia's oil, the majority of it, is located in its eastern part of the country, along the Persian Gulf, and then offshore under the waters of the Persian Gulf. And Saudi Arabia's oil lies in kind of shallow pools, not very deep underground or underwater. And so they have way less cost for drilling and for recovery, for pumping, than does a country like Russia, for example. So that's what's facing off here in this oil price war, Russia and Saudi Arabia. Well, how did the Saudis react when the Russians said, no, we're not playing along with this price, we're not playing along with this production cut? Well, the Saudis then not only announced significant price cuts and discounts to customers who were buying their oil, but also a production increase of 2.5 million barrels per day. Now, I don't know if they can actually produce 2.5 million extra barrels of oil per day, but that's what they announced in any case. And the full-blown price war was on. And that is what we're dealing with right now as production around the world, not just these places, but around the world, including here in the United States, outstrips demand for the moment. And oil products are piling up in either depots or sometimes held in tankers, oil tanker ships offshore, piling up as prices drop. Now, we'll say as customers who drive cars, well, you know, we're glad to see the lower prices at the pump, yes, but keep in mind that producers, whether that's in Saudi Arabia or Russia or the United States, have a certain price point at which it is, you know, on one side of that price point, it is, it's productive, it is profitable to produce that oil, and on the other side of that price point, it is not profitable, and they begin to lose money. Recall here that the revolution, really, in oil production in the United States has to do with our technology in fracking and shale oil recovery. And also then thank you, President Donald Trump, for removing the most onerous of the regulations that held back this kind of oil drilling and recovery. But our producers too have that price point. So this is all going on, and it's, you know, nobody's going to blink yet. We'll have to see through the summer as the permafrost in Russia melts into mush, you know, which way things go. Now, each side, as I've kind of tried to show, has an advantage in one way or the other. But Russia's budget, let me mention, requirements are less than the Saudi budget requirements. In particular, the Vision 2030, you may have heard of this program pushed by the Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, or MBS, the monetary, the budget requirements to what they want to do, diversify the economy away from just extractive energy field and to diversify into lots of other fields, from biotech to computer technology to you name it. That is projected to cost a lot of money for the Saudis. So their budget requirements are higher than Russia's budget requirements in the immediate future right now. But also the Russians have taken advantage of higher oil prices in months past to salt away some savings. And so the Russians also have a bit of a better cushion, you might say, than the Saudis do. So, you know, which side is in a better position? There's pros and cons, as you can see here. So we're going to have to wait, and we're going to have to see which side blinks first, if either does, but at the moment, that is where we're at. Speaking of oil, I'll just mention Iran briefly in this context, completely out of the game. Because of maximum pressure sanctions, the regime imposed by President Trump, in particular after the United States pulled out of the Iranian nuclear deal, JCPOA, Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, back in May of 2018, and particularly after the sanctions then were reimposed and imposed tougher and harder than ever in the time since then. Iran's production has fallen to, I don't know, a few hundred thousand barrels per day, down from a peak of millions of barrels per day. So they're in a very, very tough spot economically. Their economy is in a tailspin. We'll come back to Iran in a bit here towards the end of this presentation. Let's move quickly here to other parts of the Middle East, specifically Israel, and the ongoing Hamas-Hezbollah threat to Israel that continues even as all the rest of this turmoil goes on around it, and internally, Israel is facing electoral chaos as that country tries to get to a place of forming the next government after a succession of 3 elections, indecisive. Parliamentary system. All right. In early March, Ismail Haniyeh, who is the head of the Hamas political wing, political bureau, you might say, was in Lebanon. Okay, think about this. Sunni Hamas, which is the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, Sunni, in Lebanon, in Beirut, meeting with Hezbollah, Shiite, Iranian Islamic terror proxy, and being interviewed, that's Ismail Haniyeh, being interviewed on Hezbollah's Al Mayadeen TV channel. Okay, I think this should underline for us once again the Sunni Shiite overall Islamic alliance against the Kufar, Dar al-Islam versus the Dar al-Harb. Now, Hamas has been at its leadership level involved in discussions and talks with the Israelis about how to tamp down the violence, the incessant shooting of rockets and missiles into Israeli civilian communities like Sderot, where many of us have been, and other places even farther away from the Gaza-Israel border. So Hamas is willing to engage in that kind of talk for a limited kind of an arrangement to ease the humanitarian hardships in Gaza, which are very real. The population in Gaza is in a very, very difficult economic situation, which the Hamas leadership doesn't really do much to help, because they have refused many kinds of offers from the Israelis to ameliorate those situations, and they don't do it. Hamas obviously rejects any kind of serious or long-term arrangement, a lull in its offensive shooting of missiles and rockets, that could force Hamas somehow to abandon its fundamental positions, like continuing its military buildup of its military forces and its armaments, its weapons. And so that will go on. Most important right now, I think, is that Israel has got to shake itself out of its political deadlock to deal with these threats, which are not going to go away, whether they are able to form a government or not. All right, let me conclude here with the last topic I want to bring you tonight, and that is about Iran, Iraq, missile attacks there, and how the United States has responded to that. So back last week, we had again a rocket missile attack against a U.S. Presence at a place called Camp Taji. It's an Iraqi military base somewhat to the northwest of Baghdad in Iraq. And this time, 2 American troops and 1 British soldier were killed. 12 more coalition troops were injured. You'll remember last year, right? In December, when one of those Iranian-commanded Shiite terror militias, Kataib Hezbollah was its name, did the same thing, killed an American at that time and injured, I think it was 2 more at that time in December. And what did that trigger? That crossed President Trump's red line, and he responded with strikes, military airstrikes against 5 different Kataib Hezbollah military bases and weapons depot sites. Now, the thing about Wednesday, the 11th of March, when this attack took place this time, is that happened to be the date of former, now deceased, Quds Force Commander, Major General Qasem Soleimani's birthday. March 11 was his birth date. And so one might think that was the trigger, so to speak, for those attacks. Well, those attacks killed 2 more Americans, a British soldier, and injured a whole bunch more. Once again, Kataib Hezbollah, its Quds Force commander, and now that is Ismail Ghani, successor to Soleimani, and the Iranian regime, the Islamic regime of Iran in Tehran. They crossed the red line. General Kenneth McKenzie, who is the commander of U.S. forces in the Middle East, immediately assigned responsibility. They knew right away who did this, accused Kataib Hezbollah of launching the attack. And Secretary of State Mike Pompeo tweeted out very quickly, "The attack will not be tolerated." That's a quote from him. And very early then, the very next day, Thursday, the 12th of March, 10 U.S. airstrikes were carried out across the al-Bukarami region in eastern Syria, near the border with Iraq. Again, these are bases, these are sites that are identified with Kataib Hezbollah. All right, so that establishes, I think, a new MO for the United States, and I think it's so important that President Trump is doing this after literally decades of letting this regime in Iran walk all over us. Worse than that, murder, maim, kidnap, kill Americans, civilians, and military, dating all the way back to the seizure of our American embassy in Tehran, November 1979, right up on through to December of last year, 2019, and everything that happened in between those dates. And no US president until President Trump stood up and said to that Islamic regime in Tehran, "That's it, no more, you have crossed the line, and this is just retaliation, just retribution," until President Trump, who assigned the raid against Quds Force Commander Qasem Soleimani, in which he was killed, and also the commander of Kataib Hezbollah, that militia, killed alongside of him near Baghdad airport on January the 3rd this year, 2020. until President Trump. He has now laid down a new red line, and when it's crossed, he responds. I think that's incredibly important in terms of reestablishing U.S. Deterrence in the Middle East, and also vis-a-vis Iran specifically, although the others are watching, of course. Okay, last couple of notes here I wanted to bring to you. I want to go back to Iran and the situation that it is in. They've got admitted, I mean, allowed to be, admitted 14,000 confirmed cases in Iran of the COVID-19 virus. Their economy has totally flatlined. People, I watch videos on social media coming out of Iran. People on those videos talk about ghost cities. There's nobody on the streets. The shops are shuttered. The schools are closed. Businesses are not functioning. Everything is canceled. And then you may have seen this on social media, the internet. There are these huge excavation sites, earth excavation sites in Iran that have been, I guess, filmed by Google Earth or satellite somehow. And obviously those are burial sites. Humongous trenches being dug, caught on overhead imagery to bury the many poor Iranian people who are taking the brunt of this. But I will tell you what, they cannot even protect their own senior leadership. No, they've never cared about the people, but their own leadership, which is overwhelmingly skewed to an upper age level, 80s and 90s for some of these Ayatollahs. So there's that. But they are catching this and dropping over dead. I named some of those last week in my presentation for you, that I will add to that the most recent couple of them who have died of this. Brigadier General Nasser Shabani, a very senior top IRGC commander, Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps commander, died just this past Friday of the coronavirus. In addition to at least another 5 top IRGC commanders whose names I don't have. And then just, I think today or the day before, maybe yesterday, the Ayatollah Hashem Golpegani also died of the coronavirus. No loss there either. He was one of the worst of the worst. So the final one that I'll mention here is there is word, can't confirm it for sure, but word coming out of Lebanon that Hezbollah Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah and also other senior members of Hezbollah are reported ill with COVID-19. Now, they live underground in bunkers 24/7 anyway, so whether they are now in an extra level of quarantine or not, we don't know. We don't actually have confirmation of those reports that they are ill with COVID-19. But Allah knows best, right? And that report came after those senior Hezbollah officials met with Iranian military officials coming to Lebanon from Iran. So we shall see how that turns out. So let me leave it there. I've covered a lot of different topics here and a lot of information thrown at you, but if there's some questions, I'll welcome them now. Thank you very much.
Claire, thank you so much. You know, we've started these news analysis programs for a reason, and I think your work tonight and in the past really sets up, exposes why we're doing it. This is what we need. People want to have a broad-based cover of multiple stories where there's linkages, fine, and they want to have the perspective of somebody who's lived in the world, lived outside the United States, and had the background that you have. So thank you. You're setting the standard for that. Getting great comments, just people appreciating a sober, detailed, not hysterical, not politically motivated explanation of the news.
Well, you know, I give a tip of the hat to Christine Douglas Williams, who set the standard with her presentation last Monday, and I kind of modeled mine after what she did. So thanks, Christine.
Well, and you can see the world is changing day to day, et cetera. So this is really in demand, and we're going to be continuing the news analysis programs They seem to be the things that give us the ability to be nimble in the conversations that we're providing to people. We'll continue to have in-depth webinars, including tomorrow night, by the way. But so thank you for this. I think we've got some questions. I think maybe there's some questions about your comment on the UK. It sounded like the UK had a little bit of an unusual approach to solving a problem by making it worse. I mean, do we understand that?
This is what I am understanding from the research I did today. Now, there is a concept in epidemiology called the herd immunity. And what this means is that in societies, people or animals actually, in which a virus has spread, there is a certain tipping point, apparently about 60%, at which the virus runs out of new victims. And at that point, with 60% of that population exposed, either having gotten well or succumbed, one or the other, the virus has no place left to go. Now, in much more lethal viruses like Ebola, for example, this happens much more quickly. But this is the model, I guess, that we are seeing British leadership cite as their program for Britain. I mean, I can hardly get my head around this, as I said before, but this is what they're going for. And I think maybe in their defense a little bit is the fact that the mortality rate for COVID-19 is so very, very low. They're willing to allow 60% of their population to come down with it and develop immunity.
Well, I think one of the other things I read about the UK as one of their plans is potentially inviting the people over 70 to either self or be quarantined for up to 4 months. They want that part of this is for 70 and over to stay isolated for 4 months. So that's part of
you know, but with kids home from school and parents probably still needing to go to work if their work is still open and not online, who's taking care of those kids? Might it not be grandma and grandpa? And these kids can be carriers, as we've said, although they themselves might not come down with it.
The other observation that you made that somebody's commenting on is this notion of cheap labor. What will we do for cheap labor, whether we are consumers or producers? So to move people halfway around the world from China into northern Italy, to lower the price world, to improve, I assume, the profit margin or whatever, is quite an endeavor. And of course, America's done that as well. We've moved masses of people into America on the notion of cheap labor. And we're not just talking about farm workers, we're talking about people that work in Midwestern food processing, and without any real care for, you know, some of the implications that we see in places like Minnesota and Michigan and Idaho. So this whole notion of just cheap labor being the guiding thing, whether it makes sense long-term or not, it's just another comment we've got.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a very good comment. You know, there is a balancing act to be had between free market capitalism, and we support that, I support that, and some level of moral responsibility. Yes, there will be some level of government regulations too, but there also needs to be, in a moral society anyway, such as what ours is supposed to be, some kind of moral considerations that perhaps temper all-out mercantilism, which one might call what the Chinese do, that tempers unrestricted free market capitalism.
Well, another comment will put us into this notion of morality. Will the psychological impact of what's happening in America today have an impact on people who maybe, God was taken out of the schools, and for many people, God was taken out of their lives. So one wonders, when we're now faced with mortality across the globe, what will the endpoint be in terms of the general American psyche? Will they seek out a more moral world? Will they put pressure on corporations, et cetera, et cetera?
Well, I mean, even with this now, it's coming down to dollars and cents. It's coming down to hard economics. If by the fact that we have allowed so much of our production and supply chain to come out of China, if that is devastating a good part of the world economy, including here in the United States, then that doesn't even make economic sense anymore. And that will drive change, as I was suggesting before in the first instance. Industry here will begin to produce products at home that they had farmed out earlier, perhaps. I mean, even from a dollars and cents perspective, things are going to change.
Right, and they're going to be changing at the individual person's level. They may pay less for gas, but their tax bill may go up. On the other hand, they may become more dependent. So one comment here is that one more. Okay, here we go. This crisis will usher in the socialists in November. That's just a statement. Small businesses will be wiped out with months of forced quarantine and closure. The U.S. economy and the world economy will be in shambles, and people will be desperate. And most of the time when people are desperate, they turn to government to solve it. And so this person is asking for comment on the implications of chaos and suffering.
Well, I mean, that is obviously a worst case scenario, which the Trump administration is doing its absolute level best to avoid. And that's why all of the measures already announced have been rolled out. Yes, it's going to get worse here. Yes, it's going to be bad in Europe as well. But again, if the measures that the Trump administration has promised, pan out, come through for industries, maybe not for every single small business, but if we can, like the president said, get this to flow through by the late summer, then the third quarter of this 2020 year could begin to see an improvement in the economic situation. And I am hopeful that's the course of action we're going to see, and things will begin to pick up again by that latter part of this year.
You're reminding me of the psychology and the mentality and decision making of an expert businessman. Some of us working in private industry half of our lives, and then the public sector before that. Dramatic difference just in the quality of problem solving, the incentives, etc., what people can really achieve. Ideally, this is a business person who could be a turnaround expert. People are brought in to turn around corporations. Well, if anybody could turn around a country that's in free fall right now to some degree, it would be an exceptional business person. And hopefully that is what we have. And you compare that to the, operation by committee or least common denominator kind of to be honest, a government bureaucratic solution, etc. So let's keep our fingers crossed that we've got the right man and the right problem solver in place.
I mean, the last thing on earth we need is socialism. And any number of examples around the world, including current ones right now in places like Venezuela, that is not the direction that we need to go, and we will not go that way.
And we can wonder or compare what, as he takes his actions this year, what would it be like if Hillary was in charge, or Joe or Bernie, and compare those kind of interactions, including, all of the above. So another question here. The Blue and White Party has so much power. Prime Minister willing to create a new government against Netanyahu. What about that? What can we do? I don't. I'm not sure.
This isn't it's not our business. It's not our country. It's not our election. The best we can do is offer the support, the backing of the United States government for the overall state of Israel. And support for its success, its hopefully speedy success in putting together a good representative government. I've read some analysis today that seems to suggest that Benny Gantz, the Blue and the Whites, will not succeed in being able to put together a government. And looking to the Arab parties, which seek nothing but the destruction of the Jewish state of Israel is probably going to help doom that effort by Benny Gantz and the blue and white, at which point they're going to have to, the president would probably have to turn back around and ask the two of them, Likud and blue and whites, to form a government of national unity, a crisis government, I guess, as it were.
I think at a time like this, it's particularly important that the president is being aggressive with the enemy, with Iran, and not showing weakness. That's probably one of the best things Israel's got going for it, is that you have a strong leader in this president, and he is very, very supportive of Israel. So hopefully that will help them make the right decisions. Another person has a question about how do we trust any of the numbers coming out of Iran or China?
Oh, we don't.
This person
Answer
says,
that one really quickly. We don't.
Yeah, this person's commented they could be bearing dissidents as well as virus
Sure.
body, and
Absolutely.
This is what they do.
Yep.
So we are in definite bad shape on that score. Another person just pointed out that in Manila, in the Philippines, the government every company in Manila has been ordered to close for 1 month, giving all employees a 1 month vacation with pay, including, and the point on that was U.S. call centers are closing, and even the ability for us to be online and not, buying online, etc. That requires access to call centers and so on and so forth. So that's just a kind of a comment.
Yeah.
Again, the globalism we have is extraordinary. Maybe this will pick us up to the degree that we've already been globalized.
Absolutely interlinked worldwide.
Yeah. Well, I think that's the end of our questions, and we want to thank you again and invite you maybe to give us a closing remark, and then we'll end the meeting. Before we do that, I did forget, tomorrow night, we want people to know that we have a webinar with Liz Yor. Liz is a Roman Catholic. She's going to be speaking about Chrislam and the fact that the Abrahamic Family Center is real and happening, and that Chrislam is real, is for real, and that people need to come to grips with it, including devout Catholics who have to figure out where they stand. So that's tomorrow night. So Claire, thank you again, and give us a closing remark if you would, please. Sure.
Well, thanks to you, Dick, and to Mary there behind the scenes. Thank you, Sharia Crime Stoppers and the United West, Tom Trento and the team that sponsor the program. And I will tell you that you may reach me or see me, see my writing and other things. As I mentioned on Drudge, where I will be posting regularly in a blog on the Drudge report. You may also look for me occasionally at newsmax.com, where I also have a blog. Post there on a regular, although not terribly frequent basis. You may find me, all my pieces, all my videos and everything shown certainly at the unitedwest.com, but also at Citizens Commission on National Security, ccns.org. And then on social media, I'm at Clare M. Lopez, and Facebook, also my name, Clare M. Lopez. And I am working on a website. I will be working on that over recent or coming weeks, hopefully to have that up at some point soon for Lopez Liberty LLC. Thank you very much, everybody, for tuning in.
And Claire will be back on the 30th of March and think of all the news that's going to happen between now and then, and we'll get her expert analysis. Thank you, Claire.
Thank you.